So Chris Kline is our speaker tonight, and I thank you for being here
Sure.
virtually. He's the director of Butterfly Ridge, and I'll just mention a little bit about what they do, because that speaks to Chris and his wife. So Butterfly Ridge Conservation Center is a limited liability company owned by Christopher and Chris Kline. The initial idea for Butterfly Ridge came into being in early 2014. The idea was to have a garden that would focus on the health and well-being of butterflies native to southeastern Ohio. Ultimately, the goal is that the garden will be open to the public to visit and learn about butterflies, moths, and other pollinators. So anyhow, if you want to add anything else that maybe happened recently that's not listed on your website, but
yeah, I mean, we've been open to the public since 2017, and then last year we started our nonprofit arm of the business, which is called the Polygonia Foundation. And Polygonia Foundation handles largely education and conservation outreach. So it's through the Polygonia Foundation that we do a lot of our moth lighting events. It's through Polygonia that we now do our seed sharing. For those of you who don't know, we give away seed of native plants free of charge to whoever wants it. And if they want to make a donation to Polygonia Foundation, they can. They don't have to. Last year we gave away, oh geez, how many? I want to say 300 or 400 seed packets to like 60, 70 different people, probably in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 different species. We like to help people get started with native plants as inexpensively as possible, because I'm not sure what things are like up there in Cleveland, but down here in my neighborhood, native plant nurseries are few and far between, and most of them can be quite expensive. So we wanted to give folks a way to kind of get their feet wet with growing native plants, and then if they decided that they liked it, then they could, go to the expensive nurseries and spend all the money they wanted. So yeah, we started that nonprofit arm last year.
Thank you. So I think we're ready to start the topic and hear more about the Monarchs and Misinformation.
Okay, well, and this is a talk that I started doing, I forget how many years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. Danielle's maybe heard this once down at Pawpaw Festival. But I keep updating it every year because the information / misinformation continues to change pretty much every year. And so let me try to use this share feature here to get my slideshow up. Let's see, can everybody see that, hopefully?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. There we go. And so basically what this is a series of like 20 true and false questions. And I realize my time's a little limited, so we'll go through some of the questions pretty quickly, and then other questions we'll spend a little bit more time with. Most of these questions come from the research that I've done as part of the Southwest Monarch Study. I was the founder of that out in Arizona. And then some of these questions are stuff that I've especially heard on social media. And so we'll just kind of jump into it. And again, several of you don't know me from anybody and don't know why I'm qualified to talk about monarchs. So for example, this is the front page of a peer-reviewed paper that I wrote with Gail and Scott Morris on the status of Danus plexippus in Arizona. So basically, this documented our data from the first 10 years of the Southwest Monarch Study. And this was published in the Journal of the Lepidopterist Society, so you can look that up if you would like, published in 2015. So our first question, true or false? Monarchs are officially endangered in the United States. And with doing it this way, I'm not sure how people could vote. So just think about in your minds, I guess, whether you think it's true or false. And the correct answer is false. Okay, monarchs are not endangered. A big part of the confusion came about because a conservation organization in Europe, specifically Switzerland, they decided to declare monarchs as endangered back in 2022. Keep in mind the IUCN has zero enforcement capabilities here in the US. So their word doesn't hold any more weight than my word or the word of any of you folks. In the US, you have to be declared threatened or endangered specifically by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And until they list you with the Endangered Species Act, you are not endangered. Being endangered is not a state of mind, as I had one person try to convince me. To be endangered, there's an official process that has to happen. And then something that I actually learned today was the IUCN actually in 2023 changed their minds and decided North American monarchs were not endangered. So in 2022, they said they were. In 2023, they said they weren't. So for what it's worth, personally, I think it was a fundraising scheme as much as anything else, because there's a lot of money in the world of monarchs. Our next question, true or false? The butterfly most deserving of federal protection is the monarch. Little bit of an opinion question here. In my opinion, that answer is false. There are actually several butterfly species in the United States whose populations have declined way more drastically than what the monarchs have, including the regal fritillary, the rogo skipper, and the Atoe skipper. All of those, all three of those are victims of the agriculturalization of the Great Plains. All of those used to be very common in the prairies on the Great Plains. And then as livestock and farming moved into the Great Plains, those butterflies got pushed out. So once again, there are several butterflies that are in far worse shape than what monarchs are. Our next question, monarchs will soon be extinct. So this is the second of what I call the E words. Okay, the first E word is endangered. The second E word is extinct. Okay, and a lot of folks misuse these words. So the answer to that one is also false. Keep in mind, for monarchs to go extinct, every monarch in the world has to die. So that's monarchs in North America, Hawaii, Australia, the Caribbean, Central and South America, New Zealand. Every last one of those monarchs has to die for monarchs to go extinct. Okay. I don't see that happening. I really, really don't. Now, word of warning, mark my words, and if I'm wrong, I'll come back to your March, April, June Zoom meeting next year. You're going to be hearing a lot of these E words as February and March of next year rolls around, because monarchs are having a bad year here in Eastern North America. A bad year that will, my hunch, will probably rival several of the recent bad years, which I'll be showing you shortly. So don't be surprised if you start hearing people throwing endangered and extinct around next February. Okay. Don't fall for it. Okay. because they're not endangered and they're not going to be going extinct. And here shortly, I'll show you why. Our next question. Hand-raising monarchs does not add significantly to the overall population. I don't know how many of you captive raise monarchs. Generally, that answer is true. Scientists estimate that roughly at the most 500,000 monarchs are raised by enthusiasts every year. If you compare that to the number of monarchs estimated in Mexico during the winter of 2021, at best, 1% of those monarchs were hand raised. So most likely our captive rearing projects that we do with our families or with our schools or whatever, honestly, you're probably not putting much of a dent in the overall population of the monarch. True or false, hand-raised monarchs will not successfully migrate. There is one researcher in particular out of the University of Georgia who has spent most of his adult life trying to convince you of this, okay, that hand-raised monarchs will not successfully migrate. And the answer to that is false. Monarch Watch reported 22% of those who reared and tagged monarchs in 2020 had a monarch successfully recovered in Mexico. The Southwest Monarch Study, which I started, reported a higher recovery rate of reared monarchs than wild monarchs from 2015 through 2019. So in other words, those captive raised monarchs from a recovery perspective, from a migrating perspective, actually perform better than the wild monarchs. Now, one thing you'll notice, I always put the word wild in quotes. Okay, there's a reason why. If you walk out onto your property, if I walk out on the Butterfly Ridge and I catch a monarch butterfly and I tag him, when I'm recording that data, I will be recording it as a wild monarch, okay? I would argue that's a little bit of a misnomer because I don't know that monarch's history before he found his way into my field and into my butterfly net. It might have been some wonderful little old lady in Lancaster that raised him from a caterpillar. She let him go, and then I happened to find him in my field here at Butterfly Ridge. Technically, he would not qualify as wild, okay? So I'm not a big fan of that term wild because we're making some assumptions about the monarch's history that we honestly don't really know. But since that's the term that's generally used in the research and in the conversations, then I will use it here. But once again, there is absolutely no shortage of evidence, no shortage of documentation of captive reared monarchs successfully migrating to either Mexico or California. Our next question, true or false? Planting tropical milkweed, not sure how many of you've got that. Planting tropical milkweed in your yard will cause monarchs to get sick and die. And I've been approached with this one on a pretty regular basis. And the answer to that is false. Now, there has been a documented link between OE and tropical milkweed. However, that link, the research that presented that link was found to take place specifically in the Gulf states, in the deep South, where it's so hot and humid. To my knowledge, there's no links, no evidence of that here in the Midwest. I know there's no evidence of it in the desert Southwest. Monarchs in the desert Southwest are rarely found with OE. OE just does not do well in dry climates. OE is a parasite on monarchs. I believe it's like a little protozoan. that can impact a monarch's ability to fly. It can impact wing development, making sure that the wings develop correctly, that sort of thing. So when you hear in the news media or at meetings or whatever that you shouldn't plant tropical milkweed because it kills monarchs, well, that's not actually true. Okay. Now, if you live in southern Mississippi, yeah, you might want to double think that. But here in Ohio, it's probably not a problem. True or false? Planting tropical milkweed in your yard will cause monarchs to not migrate in fall. A friend of mine very adamantly believes this one. Okay. The problem is there's no evidence of it. So while lab simulations try to make this claim, there has yet to be any real world tagging based evidence of free flying monarchs migrating, being impacted by tropical milkweed. The thing that is convincing monarchs to stick around, for example, in my case in Southeast Ohio, in your case, Northern Ohio, the thing that encourages monarchs to stick around longer than they should, I would argue, is not tropical milkweed. What it is actually what we are experiencing right now, and that is unseasonably hot temperatures in late summer and fall. Okay, because for example, Butterfly Ridge, there is no tropical milkweed. Okay, none of our neighbors have tropical milkweed. Yet in years where we've had 85-degree weather in October, we've seen monarchs flying around. Well, I know it can't be the tropical milkweed because nobody in my neighborhood has tropical milkweed. So it has to be something else. And I would argue it's the warm temperatures that are in fact causing that. True or false? Hand-raised monarchs should be exposed to natural light and temperature. Once again, not sure how many of you raise monarchs from caterpillars. That answer is true. Monarchs tend, well, butterflies and moths in general, tend to use light and temperature cues to proceed through their life cycle. So you want those caterpillars being able to experience natural light to some level and natural, temperatures at some level. True or false? Eastern monarchs and Western monarchs are two different species. And maybe to kind of make sure everybody's up to speed, monarchs in the Eastern United States tend to migrate to the mountains outside of Mexico City, in the state of Michoacan, Mexico. Monarchs in the Western United States tend to migrate to coastal California, coastal Baja, kind of that neighborhood. Okay. And something I've heard frequently is that Eastern monarchs and Western monarchs are actually two different species. And that is not correct. Okay. The two main populations are actually genetically identical. I'm not sure if anybody knows what the triggers are to that determine, so that monarchs know what direction they're supposed to go. That I'm not sure, but from a DNA perspective, both populations are identical. True or false, the continental divide is the dividing line between that east and that west population. And technically, that answer is also false. Now, generally speaking, roughly speaking, yeah, the continental divide can be considered that. However, monarchs in the desert Southwest, they actually cross the divide in order to get to overwintering sites in Mexico. One thing that you'll notice on my little map here, if you look at Arizona, you've got orange arrows going. Some of those one orange arrow is actually going west, northwest. You've got another orange arrow that is going southeast. One of the things that we discovered through the Monarch study is monarchs in Arizona and the desert Southwest actually migrate both directions. So while monarchs in the east are primarily going south and southwest down to Mexico, monarchs west of the Continental Divide are going southwest to coastal California. In Arizona, monarchs are going actually opposite directions. Some go southeast, some go northwest. What determines whether you migrate southeast or northwest is something that we're still trying to figure out. My initial thought, and the initial thought of Gail Morris, who has taken the Monarch study over since I moved back to Ohio, our initial thought that it was actually related to weather patterns, in that in the desert Southwest, from basically July through September, you have a monsoonal weather pattern, meaning that storms are actually coming from the east off of the Gulf of Mexico into Arizona. It's called the monsoon. At the entire rest of the year, the weather patterns tend to come in off of the Pacific through California that way. Well, what we were initially finding, the initial data was indicating monarchs that were migrating earlier in the season, okay, September, were the ones that were tending to head towards California, which one could reasonably think, okay, well, that's the influence of the wind direction coming off the Gulf of Mexico, pushing them to California. And monarchs that were migrating more towards October, it was kind of the opposite situation. You know, storms coming in off the Pacific were pushing them southeast into Mexico. More recent data doesn't back up that initial idea. So we honestly don't know what determines which direction they go. Okay, it's another one of those mysteries. Our next true and false question: there is no mixing of the eastern and western populations. And that answer is false. And once again, if I go back to my previous map, if I can get there, maybe oh, there we go. So you'll notice down there in Mexico, you've got monarchs coming in from the west, crossing the Continental Divide to overwinter in Mexico, with monarchs that have come down from the east. So there is a definite mixing of east and west. The idea is some of those eastern monarchs in the spring, in February and March, might actually follow their friends from Arizona and actually return west. Some of those Arizona monarchs might join their friends and on the return trip actually go east instead of back to Arizona. So in other words, there's a lot that is still not known. Okay, so the same monarch that leaves Ohio in the fall will return to the same spot in Ohio in the spring. You have no idea how many people have asked me that question at Butterfly Ridge. That answer is false. The monarchs that return to Ohio, usually we get our first wave kind of late May, early June. They are most likely the grandchildren, maybe the great grandchildren of that monarch that flew south in the fall. Okay. How it works, that monarch that leaves Ohio on September, whatever today is, September 19th, I think. When they fly down to Mexico, they stay in Mexico for the winter, which actually doesn't sound like a bad idea. And then around about February-ish, they start the return trip north. They will only make it as far as roughly the Rio Grande Valley. Okay. On the trip down, the reason why they're able to fly so far is they are in what's called biological diapause, which means they're putting all interest in reproduction on hold. And instead of spending that energy on reproduction, they're spending that energy on flying. Okay, they get to Mexico, February rolls around, they will do what we call break diapause. They suddenly realize, oh, I'm surrounded by members of the opposite sex. Mate, continue trying to make the trip north, but run out of gas when they get roughly to the Rio Grande Valley, lay their eggs, northern Mexico and in the Rio Grande Valley. The kids will then continue the trip north and east. Okay, and once again, what we see in Ohio, May and early June usually is the grandkids that we see. True or false? The monarch population is in significant decline. Honestly, that depends who you talk to. There's actually a researcher by the name of John Boyle who says that is absolutely false, that the current monarch population is actually a whole lot bigger than it was in pre-colonial America. And he's basing a lot of that on how the Great Plains, how that land management changed once settlers started to move out there. I'm not sure that I buy Mr. Boyle's arguments. However, if you look at the data and realize we only have data going back 20, 25 years, we could say that both the eastern and western populations are definitely showing a significant decline. However, over the short term, one could argue that the populations are in fact somewhat stable. So here we've got a picture of data collected in the overwintering sites in Mexico. This data normally comes out, well, the data is collected in January, and then it normally comes out to the public kind of late February and early March. And one thing you'll notice, I don't know if you can see my little arrow there or not, that the population over the last 15 years or so has been relatively stable in this 2 to 2.5 hectare range. Now, what that is that's the amount of space that the overwintering monarchs take up. Okay, they don't try to actually count every single monarch just because there's so many of them. When you're talking counting to 45 or 50 million and they're all flying around, it's really hard to do that. So they make their estimates based on the amount of land area that the monarchs are occupying when they're overwintering in Mexico. And you can see for the most part, we've been hanging out right around that 2.5 hectare years. We've had some good years. But normally things usually bounce back to that 2.5. As I mentioned earlier, expect next spring for people to be in crisis and panicking because the population is going to be so low. My hunch is the overwintering population in Mexico is going to be down at that range. Okay, it's going to be really low. But once again, if you notice, every time the population's gotten really low, within a year or two, it bounces back. Okay, here in 2009 and 10, we went really low. 10 and 11, it bounced back. 04 and 05 was pretty low, bounces back by 06, 07. Year 2000, 2001, that winter was really low, and look how it bounced back. Every year it bounces back. Okay. So when the numbers are presented in February, March, and the numbers are really low, it will bounce back. Okay. This is the data from California. Once again, you will notice since roughly the year 2000, 1999, the population's actually been relatively steady right around this 200,000 line here. Once again, we've had some good years and we've had some bad years. Okay, 2018-19 was really bad years. Okay, 2020. And once again, the population always bounces back. Now, I haven't heard much about the Western population, what kind of shape it's in this year. I don't know if they've experienced drought conditions quite like we have. But just to give you an idea. So, true or false, the monarch population decline is being caused by illegal logging in Mexico. Once upon a time, that actually was the case. Now, I would argue that is false. And while there is still some illegal logging in the bioreserves in Mexico, realize if that's still happening, that would not have an impact on the Western population, because with the exception of Arizona, the Western population doesn't migrate to Mexico. So the current thought, and it's really hard to prove any of this, the current thought that the decline in the West is primarily a prolonged drought situation, probably some habitat loss as well. In the East, it can be attributed largely to the expanded use of herbicides in agriculture and, once again, habitat loss. True or false? Monarch research is objective and unbiased. This one might surprise you. I would say that answer is absolutely false. There is a lot of bias in Monarch research. After all, like I said, there's a scientist out of the University of Georgia who has been working very hard the last 15 to 20 years to convince us that captive raised monarchs cannot migrate. Yet, once again, Monarch Watch, Southwest Monarch Study, the work that David James is doing in the Pacific Northwest, all show that captive reared monarchs successfully migrate. So I'm not sure where that Georgia researcher, what his issue is, but there is a lot of bias. And to give you an idea, how some of that bias works, this is an article that came out how many years ago? It wasn't that long ago. I want to say 2 or 3 years ago. And we'll say it made the rounds in social media, and people were all frisky about it. And once again, the whole panic was induced again. This paper, once again, monarch butterflies are sensitive to rearing conditions. Reared monarchs have lower fitness than wild monarchs, et cetera, et cetera. However, if you look at the next page, no data was used for the research described in this article. Okay. So all of that was basically just opinion, okay, with no data standing behind it. And that's a lot of the trouble that we have with our enthusiasm for monarchs and stuff. There's a lot of opinion out there that's not backed up by data, or in the case of this one particular researcher in Georgia, it's backed up by bad data. Okay. Scientific methods that honestly probably would struggle passing the junior high science fair. Let me direct you to a researcher that I do think is worth spending your time to look into. This is Dr. David James. He's a researcher at Washington State University, and he takes, for the most part, the complete opposite position of what that previous paper was. One of the differences with David James is he has done monarch tagging research, not only in the Pacific Northwest, but he's done tagging research in Australia. He has studied monarchs for a very long time in a variety of different settings. I think this guy has a much better feel for monarch population biology. I would argue he is definitely worth your time looking up some of the research that he has done. So once again, that's David James at Washington State. We're getting towards the end of the true and falses here. So true or false, monarch caterpillars are eating my dill. Once again, this is another one I've heard at Butterfly Ridge, and when I worked at Franklin Park Conservatory. And no, monarchs are not eating your dill. Those are black swallowtails that are eating your dill. Monarchs are very, very fussy, and they will only eat milkweed. If you take him off the milkweed and you put him on a dill, he will starve to death. Okay, they are the ultimate in picky eaters. Okay, I'm not sure if any of you are picky eaters, or maybe if you're trying to raise some picky eaters right now. Monarchs are the ultimate picky eaters. True or false? You can best help monarchs by planting milkweed. This answer might surprise you a little bit as well. I would argue that false. Okay. You can best help monarchs by creating habitat, which includes both milkweed and other nectar plants, and specifically nectar plants that will provide nectar throughout the season. Keep in mind right now, and I don't know, maybe some of you folks, you're in different conditions. The drought down here in Southeast Ohio is extreme. I've got a bunch of trees that have already lost their leaves because of the drought. All of my tulip trees are now bare. All of my sweet birch is now bare. My red maple is quickly going bare, okay, because of the drought. I haven't had milkweed flowers here at Butterfly Ridge since I can't tell you when. Okay, early to mid-July was the last milkweed flowers that I saw here. If you're just planting milkweed, then realize monarchs that are trying to migrate through right now are going to find nothing to eat. All right. And I'm kind of glad that you all had that little discussion right at the very beginning about, what's flowering in everybody's yards, because you need stuff flowering now. Okay. You need stuff flowering the entire, from April through October. Okay. Maybe not April. Let's say late May through October. So that you can meet the needs of all those different generations of monarchs. And if all you're doing is planting milkweed, then yeah, you're going to have a bunch of caterpillars, but when they grow up and become adults, you're not going to have anything for the adults to eat because the milkweed's all going to be bloomed out by that point. So that's why you need your anisicyps. That's why you need your Jerusalem artichokes. That's why you need your cardinal flowers, all that stuff. So just planting milkweed, while it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's not the best thing that you can do. Okay. I'm thinking this might have been the last one. Yep, that was the last one. So, I don't know how you all want to do this. If you want to ask questions, no, I know you're on a time frame here, so I don't want to disrupt that.
I think we're still good.
Go ahead.
If anybody has questions. Feel free to raise your hands or put questions in the chat. And thank you so much, Chris. Great.
Oh, you bet.
Oh, I see Kathy. Kathy, go ahead.
Yeah, so right now, where are the monarchs? I have seen almost none in my yard, which is quite unusual. Are we still expecting some, or have they gone by other places and we don't expect any more? What's the timing with where they're at this point?
Yeah, normally up there in northern Ohio, you would probably expect to start seeing migrating monarchs late August-ish. I would imagine definitely by the 3rd or 4th week of September, they would have moved through your area. Here at Butterfly Ridge, that migratory behavior usually occurs over most of September, like second week of September through close to the end of September. However, with that said, and I don't know, maybe I'm making assumptions here that I shouldn't. I know at least down in my neighborhood, this summer has been incredibly hot and dry. And once again, our milkweeds, they quit blooming and went crispy quite a long time ago. So monarchs may have started heading out early since everything was turning crispy. Or maybe because of the heat, they're hanging around a little bit longer. If you've got, goldenrods and asters and different things blooming, maybe they're kind of dilly-dallying, because that's what we've seen down here in the past, is when we have a really hot September, really hot beginning of October, they will dilly-dally down here and not start migrating the way they're supposed to until 2, 3, 4 weeks late, which is actually problematic. So I would think by this point, September 19, up in the Cleveland area, I would think that you would be getting towards the tail end of your migratory behavior. In a normal year, this year has been anything but normal, at least for us. So I'm not sure how that might impact things. They, like I said, they might be lollygagging a little bit. So maybe they're not totally out of the area yet. But once again, keep in mind, my hunch is this is going to be a really bad monarch year. So if you're not seeing many, it could be A, they've already gone through, or B, there wasn't very many to see to begin with.
With regards to some data, some people monitoring Wendy Park, which is one of the key areas for the monarch migration, I think they notated so they saw some roosts around, I want to say around the 10th, which is pretty on par with normal. But overall, to Chris's point, it's been low numbers. So we'll wait and see if the true batches come in, or if that what they saw on the 10th is it. Christine, I put a question in the chat. Is it helpful to cut back a half of your milkweed mid-season to get more desirable tender growth for caterpillars?
Yeah, I would argue that yes, it is. And how I encountered this, how I learned about this, for a long time I used to go hiking down at the ridges in Athens. And what the ridges is, it's actually the old state mental hospital grounds that several years back, Ohio University did a land swap with the state of Ohio, and now the Ridges is owned by OU. And actually, that's where I did my master's research years and years ago. But anyways, I used to do a lot of hiking down there. And I remember one time I came around the corner of the trail, and there were several great big huge common milkweed patches down there. I came around this corner of the trail, and some yahoo had mowed down all the common milkweed. And this was like in July. And of course, I'm like, okay, what idiot did this? And a friend of mine, her husband actually works on the grounds crew at OU. And I'm like, well, I'm going to give him a call and give him a piece of my mind and blah, 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 blah. Well, what I found about a month later was all that milkweed that had gotten mowed down had actually sprouted back up and was developing flower buds. And so what they did, and I'm sure this was not their intent by any stretch, but what they had done was they had extended the milkweed bloom season. So instead of having milkweed blooms for 3 or 4 weeks, they now had added another 3 or 4 weeks to it by mowing some patches down and keeping other patches intact. So yeah, if you have that option, and once again, especially in a good year where you have adequate rainfall and that sort of thing, then absolutely you can do that. Just make sure you check your milkweed for caterpillars before you go cutting it down. But yeah.
Sorry, I realized I was a mute. Good question, Christine. I see Diane has a question.
Yeah, I always have this curiosity, like when I've seen new monarchs come out of their chrysalis, or it seemed to appear in my garden, and I think, how the heck are they going to get all the way down to Mexico if they're only going to live like 2 weeks? So I mean, what is that? Does that really happen? Because I always think they must have more babies again when they get like to Texas or something like that.
Okay, so how lifespan works, and it's not just a monarch thing, it's actually butterflies in general. Most butterflies, as adults will live 3 or 4 weeks. However, it is very dependent upon when you're born. So if you overwinter as an adult butterfly, so for example, the migrating generation of the monarch, the eastern commas and question marks, and mourning cloaks that we have here in Ohio, if you overwinter as an adult butterfly, you will actually live more like 6 to 7 months. Okay. If, you know, that monarch that you saw flying around in late June, yeah, he's only going to live 3 or 4 weeks. A monarch that you see tomorrow in your garden, they're going to live close to 7 months. And it's all because of that diapause business. So yeah, they have absolutely more than enough time to fly down to Mexico, hang out, drink their margaritas and everything, and then start the return trip back in February. As an old track and field guide, which you would never realize looking at me now, I used to be a distance runner. The trip down in the fall, I compare to a long distance race. The trip back in the spring, I compare to a relay race. So if that makes sense, if there's any other old track and field people in the room here.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Oh, you bet.
Great. Yes, thank you. Great questions. Any other questions? So Chris, a question that I have for you. So you mentioned that maybe we should be possibly focusing on some other species. If you were to pick 1 or 2 species that you would like to see more focus on, what would you like to see those be?
Okay, this first one's gonna be a really hard sell, I realize, but hey, you guys you're wild ones, you're into this hard sell stuff. So that is thistle. Okay, specifically like field thistle or tall thistle. So native Ohio thistles. I'm not talking Canada thistle that's trying to take over the world. I'm talking our native Ohio, like prairie thistles. Okay. And once again, this was not a good year for thistle. Our thistle really struggled this year, but we love thistle here. Okay, I actively engage in hand to beak combat with goldfinches to try to get thistle seed, because when you get thistle blooming, honestly, there's no better butterfly plant than that. Okay. So yeah, we collect a lot of thistle seed, although once again, not so much this year. But in years past, I mean, we've collected thousands and thousands of thistle seeds from our plants. This year, it's only going to be hundreds of thistle seeds. Another one that I really like is ironweed. I'm a big fan of ironweed as well. And notice these species that I'm naming off typically are blooming during the beginnings of that migration period. Okay, so the thistles, the ironweeds, that will help keep the monarchs fueled up as they're trying to migrate through. Now, of course, you know, the downside with thistle is it's painful. And we actually have ways that we deal with that. To collect the seed, a trick that I learned as an intern years and years ago at the Boyce Thompson Arboretum in Arizona, when one of my jobs was to transplant cactus. What you do is you get masking tape, wrap masking tape around your fingers, and that way you can handle the thistle heads and it won't stab you through the masking tape. And then when you're done, you just peel the tape off, throw it away, and away you go. Ironweed can get big. Okay, it can get tall. I mean, honestly, we have some here at Butterfly Ridge that approaches 8-9 feet. And I realize, especially if you're like in an HOA type situation, I assume the HOA will probably frown upon stuff that is that big. But once again, when it's blooming, you're hard to find anything better as far as a good nectar plant than ironweed. So that's two that from a monarch perspective, I think can be really, really helpful.
Thank you for that, Chris.
You bet.
And my question on species though, on butterflies, if you wanted to call out another butterfly that you feel needs more, or moth that needs more attention, you know, because if monarchs don't need, you know, they get a lot of attention, what would you say needs to feel more love?
Oh boy. Wow. Because I like all of them. And yeah, that honestly, that's a hard one. You know, I would probably, well, yeah, now you got me thinking on that one.
You can always get back to us, Chris.
Oh no, I gotta follow through here. Honestly, I'm going to go with American Lady. And I know earlier at the very beginning of the meeting, somebody had mentioned that they had seen a painted lady, which was very exciting. Honestly, at Butterfly Ridge, we rarely see painted ladies. I mean, rarely. That's like a once every 3 or 4 years thing. American Lady, we see a lot every year. And that's because we have the caterpillar host plants. So I don't know if any of you have like pussy toes in your garden or sweet everlasting in your garden. Those are the caterpillar host plants for American ladies. And once again, I mean, it's such a neat looking butterfly. It's so easy to find the caterpillars. Honestly, that's probably the species that we raise the most caterpillars of, is American ladies, because the caterpillars are so easy to find. When our interns start in May, that's one of the first things we teach them to look for, because what you're like with the pussy toes, which is a very tiny little ground cover type of a plant that most people don't even notice out in their fields and such. What you look for are the leaves kind of folded over. American lady caterpillars are leaf folders. And so they'll fold the leaf over like and making a little sleeping bag. And then the caterpillar, that's basically his home base that he works out of. So we show our interns where the pussy toe patch is. We go out, we find leaves that have been folded over in the sleeping bags, and we just barely just kind of pinch it open to take a peek inside, take a peek inside. And voila, there's caterpillars there, or there's no caterpillar, but there's a bunch of frass and stuff, which tells us, well, there used to be a caterpillar there. So, you know, we keep looking. But once again, I mean, just so super easy to grow pussy toes, to grow sweet everlastings. And so the risk reward, I mean, it's a pretty low risk with a very high reward. So I would say American ladies.
Okay, good to know. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you guys so much for all the great questions. I'm sure we'll be talking again. So, all right, so let's jump
Thank you,
over to the
Chris.
rest of the agenda.
Oh, you bet. Thank you for having me. I'll go ahead and sign off now. If you have other questions, feel free to email or whatever. We can keep talking bugs in the future. So
Yes,
thank
we'd be
you.